Good evening and welcome. My name is Will Fowles. I'm the member for Ringwood in the Victorian State Parliament. Welcome to our housing panel. We begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Nation, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. This land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm joined tonight by Major Brendan Nottle, Councillor Sarah McKenzie, and Citizen Rob Pradolin, and we'll be introducing all of those fine folk for you in just a moment's time. But first, to give a bit of a recap of where we are in the housing issue in Australia. We've just had a federal election. Housing has, I think for the first time in Australian political history, really been front and centre in that campaign. That's a wholly welcome development from my perspective, and I suspect from the perspective of my guests tonight. But there's a lot happening in this space. There's lots of government intervention. There's lots and lots of thinking going on at any one time. But what we're also seeing is acute need in the homelessness community, acute need for affordable housing, and acute need for all of those, particularly younger Australians, trying to crack into the housing market. And it's for that reason that I've launched a campaign to have housing considered as a human right under the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Now, that's one potential response, and we're going to talk about a whole lot of potential responses to these problems tonight, and that's why I'll be asking our guests tonight what they think about the matter. So first to you, Councillor Sarah McKenzie, who is the Deputy Mayor of the City of Yarra and the Acting Executive Director of Per Capita, a think tank that has produced some terrific work in the housing space. Sarah McKenzie, there's a lot happening in this universe. What do you see as being the key challenges for public policymakers in housing?
Well, I think in the council space particularly, and in that local space, is about who we are prioritising and when. So City of Yarra has, obviously we have 12 of those 44 towers that have all been earmarked, but we also have we have a really diverse community in the sense of wealth and income, and part of what makes the suburbs that make up the City of Yarra so wonderful, and the things that people go there for, it's arts and that the vibe of the place, that comes from the people that live there. You know, when we talk about housing, I think a lot of the time, we're talking about, are we going to increase density? How do we get the character of the area? How do we make sure we maintain that? But the character of our area is people. So the priority in my eyes needs to be on the people that we are housing there as a first priority, second to some of the other aesthetic needs of an area. Because if it looks like Fitzroy and smells like Fitzroy, but none of the people that we think of as Fitzroyans are there, then it's not Fitzroy. And then what's the point? And for us at Yarra City Council, a big focus is the people who work in Yarra, and particularly not just in our hospitals and health services and that space, but in our nightlife and our artists. It is becoming more and more difficult to be an artist living and working in the City of Yarra, and that impacts our entire city. So we are working on a project at the moment that was on the cards a while ago and got knocked back by the council at the time to do a social housing project on some council land. A lot of this is state and federal, but there are things councils can do, and we're really interested in finding out what they are and working together in that space.
Indeed. Well, you've raised people, and if there's someone who knows a lot about people, and particularly the plight of people suffering homelessness, it's Major Brendan Nottle. Brendan is the leader of the Salvation Army in Melbourne. He's been described by at least one former Lord Mayor as an urban saint. He was the 2013 Melburnian of the Year. We're delighted to have him along tonight. Brendan Nottle, what are you seeing at the coalface as we are in the midst of this housing crisis?
Yeah, seeing a couple of things. Well, I think definitely an increase in numbers of people that are coming in to have practical needs met. So particularly around food insecurity is a massive issue. But we're seeing not just an increase in numbers, but a change of the demographic as well. So seeing a lot of young mums come in with young children. And there's often a partner involved, and between them they're out trying to work and trying to make ends meet, and they simply can't. So they can't pay rent, can't cover mortgage, and then they in a lot of cases actually can't put meals on the table. So we're hearing an increase in the number of people saying that their kids will eat, but they won't because they want to make sure the kids are eating. So that's a really major concern. I think the other issue that we're seeing an increase of is a presentation of really complex mental health issues. So we see people that are homeless, so without accommodation, but they don't have the supports to actually address the drivers for their homelessness. So we're just not seeing anywhere near enough support for people with complex mental health issues. And there was the Royal Commission into Mental Health that was conducted here in Victoria, which was a really welcome initiative, but we're not actually seeing the outflow of that in terms of response to particularly those that are really struggling with complex mental health issues. So our concern is there's a group of people that are locked out of a whole range of supports in our community. They're locked out of affordable housing. They're locked out of access to mental health supports. In some cases, locked out of access to even food security. And we're not seeing where that's going to change. We're not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel at this stage.
Indeed. Well, the lockout of a housing affordability is a massive problem. And one of the people who's doing his bit to try and address that problem is Rob Pradolin. Rob has founded Housing for All Australians. He's been involved in the property sector for 140 years or some such.
Not that old. Will, come on.
He is taking a very proactive approach about bringing the private sector to the table as we try to address these housing affordability issues. Rob Pradolin, welcome. And tell us, what do you think are the key things that government can be doing and the private sector can be doing together to try and address this housing crisis we're in?
Well, this housing crisis is so big that it's too big for government to solve alone. It is a community-wide problem, and that includes business. The first thing we do is recognise the scale of the problem. During the Morrison government, there was a report done for what they call NIFIC, which is now called Housing Australia. It quantified the shortfall in just social and affordable housing as $290 billion over the next 20 years. In terms of houses, that represents 44,500 homes built every year for 20 years in social and affordable housing.
So 44,500 new homes every year for 20 years.
That is what the report said. Now, Housing Australia, which is a great start, is aspiring to build 11,000 homes per year every year for 5 years. Where's the shortfall coming from? We have to look far broader than just the community housing space, and how do we engage the private sector in this societal problem that if we do not solve it, and we can't solve, it's going to take 30 years to solve, we're heading for a polarisation that's going to cause civil unrest, and no one will be safe in 30 years. That is what keeps me up at night, and that is why the private sector wants to be part of the solution.
Indeed. Well, the housing first model, as pioneered, I think, in one of the Scandinavian states, might have been Finland, has, I think, demonstrated a different way of looking at these issues. Brendan and Sarah, what are you seeing on the coalface in terms of people who aren't necessarily rough sleepers, but are simply working poor, that have been locked out of the ability to buy a house and are increasingly being locked out of the ability to rent a house? You're both very involved in the inner city, which has historically been an area that has had affordable housing. What are we now seeing, and how is it changing the character of our inner city? Perhaps we're starting with you, Sarah.
So in City of Yarra, 95 of every 10,000 people are homeless, according to census data. That obviously doesn't tell us the whole story. There is huge amounts of people who are marginally housed throughout different periods of their life. In City of Yarra, I think there is a really big concern, I think, around young people and I suppose people in my age group, so millennials and then below that as well, who have been told their whole lives, you work hard and you will be able to go to school, finish that, you'll be able to live comfortably. But that's not true. Now, there's been some good changes recently around housing security for that. For, I suppose, my demographic who's still renting. I'm in my 30s and I live with other people, and that security of no fault eviction is really helpful. But lack of security means that we're not putting our hands up to do that big thinking and to even take roles like mine, because you don't know if you're going to live there tomorrow. If I was evicted from my house tomorrow, there is not a single place. I mean, there's one bedroom letting at the moment in my ward, and it is absolutely not within my price budget. And I'm a professional who also works as deputy mayor. That's insane to me. So, yeah, I think that's a big issue. What's going to happen? Who said 30 years? What's going to happen in 30 years? Are we going to have the families that we have now? Will we have people in my age group doing the big policy thinking, or will they still just be trying to get on top of every day.
So we're talking there, I guess, Brendan, about young, urban, tertiary educated professionals in good jobs being absolutely at the bleeding edge of this issue. Are you seeing that change in demographic in terms of your frontline services offered out of Burke Street or elsewhere?
Yeah, that phrase, the working poor, that you mentioned before, Will, is definitely on the increase. So we're seeing that every day. So we're actually seeing people come in their high-vis gear, so they're employed, but they simply can't make ends meet. So they're coming into places like ours to get a meal and to get supports that normally they would be able to afford, but they simply can't. I think that the other issue, it's the point that Rob made before, we talk a lot about lack of affordability of housing, but its availability is the massive issue as well. So the people that we work with simply have no hope in terms of being able to find a place that's available. And then it's the issue of affordability, but availability is a massive issue too. And I think the other concern that we have is people are just choosing to get whatever they can. So what they're in is often way below par in terms of quality, but they do it because they think there's nothing else available. So they find themselves in living in some circumstances which are absolutely disgusting, and no human being should be in those conditions, but they choose to do it because they've got nothing else available.
Can I jump in on
Please,
that?
yeah.
So that's absolutely right. Of course, it's the affordability, but it's the availability of it. And I don't want to verbal him too much, but I do remember reading something that Ezra Klein said about, build the housing and we'll sort out the affordability problem later. I don't agree with that. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but that is the huge problem. So there are not affordable dwellings in City of Yarra for particularly one-bedroom lettings. That line between having your own personal housing crisis and then being on the street is just so thinner than I feel like it has ever been. And we can do that. We can increase both affordable housing while we're increasing the availability of housing by looking more into things like mandatory exclusionary zoning and those sort of things that require, or just exclusionary zoning that require a certain amount of affordable housing in every new development. I wonder what you think about that.
So Rob, that neatly segues into planning, and I guess there's a broader challenge about how, whether it's the private sector, the government, both or neither, how do we get to a point where we can again deliver affordable housing for people who want to live in the Collingwoods and the Fitzroys and the inner city? Has that ship sailed, or is there actually a solution here that might work?
Well, every day that goes past, the ship is sailing further away, so we have to start to do something, right? And I had the same discussion 14 years ago when either Brumby or Brax was Premier, but you have to allow the developer community to factor in the cost of affordable housing. If they would have listened to me 13 years ago when no one objected, if it actually they were introduced at that day, but it didn't take effect 10 years from that day, they would have factored it in. But to introduce something that's a penalty and therefore makes it unviable without actually understanding the implications is a problem. So we've wasted the last 13 years to do it, but it has to come in, otherwise we are stuffed. But I'd like to bring back
Sorry, you're talking about inclusionary zoning.
Yeah, but we need to do it in a way that the market can absorb it without putting upward pressure on costs. Otherwise, defeating purpose, right? Mm-hmm. But getting back to homelessness, we're allowing homelessness to be normalised, and it's getting worse. There's a book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Associate Professor Greg Colburn from Washington. We brought him over last year because I read in his book one line that stood out to me. In New York on one night, 98,000 people are either in crisis or on the street. That is the same as Australia. We are 122,000, which includes couch surfing. The US don't. We can still solve it. And he explained that to 1,000 business people across Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. We have to start to educate because homelessness is the canary in the coal mine to a much bigger issue than the housing continuum. And if we do not do affordable housing for key workers, no one's going to be in the city of Yarra pouring the coffee. And if we don't have that affordable housing, guess what's going to happen? Trickles ultimately into homelessness. Initially, they're fine. But after a period of time on the street, then you start to have mental health problems. Then it costs society. This is an economic problem as well as a social problem. So it really has to be looked holistically.
And has City of Yarra responded to that particular challenge that you have obviously very difficult economic factors that probably sit beyond your bailiwick as a local council, but also quite specific and acute challenges in mental health and other service areas that you might actually be delivering. You're sort of feeling the pinch from that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's not just mental health as well. It's drug use too. So we've obviously got the medical safe injecting room in Richmond, and I think at the last inquiry into it, something like 36%, or I probably gave the numbers wrong, of people who present are homeless. You know, these things are all connected. So, I think that's a really good point. As far as what the city does, obviously we advocate a lot, but mental health support is something that is a bit of a shared responsibility between us and the Victorian government. But yeah, no, there is that is a serious issue in City of Yarra, and the way that it's seen by people, I think, can be quite upsetting. You know, you see homelessness and also drug taking, and it is so easy to either normalize it and then to stop seeing them as human beings, whereas we should be approaching it with compassion. And I feel like that is happening less and less because you're so used to it. When I was younger, you'd walk down the street, it would be very rare to see people. And I remember, sorry, I'm hogging this, but I remember when I went to London for the first time, and it wasn't even that long ago, but I remember going to London and I've never seen anything like this before. Like, this is incredibly, I mean, in a country that looks a lot like my country, the streets that look like the streets I live in, I've never seen people so ill on the side of the road. I'm talking open sores and things like that. And over the last 5 years, I've got slowly more and more used to walking past people on the street who look the same.
We are normalising.
It is, yeah.
I think the concern too is we're worried that there's a form of apartheid, very subtle, but a form of apartheid that's being introduced here. So not deliberately, but it's in our attitudes towards people that are sleeping rough. So we're seeing it around the CBD where there's individuals and actually organised groups are saying, we don't want those people here. So they're actually actively working to move a particular group of people out of certain parts of the city and saying very clearly, you are not welcome here. And I think when we do that with people that are sleeping rough, we're putting up a really huge barrier that prevents them from actually moving forward, because they say, well, we're locked out. We're completely locked out. And then they give up. And then when you're trying to engage that group and trying to get them the support they need, they've given up. And it's incredibly difficult. So I think we've got to make sure that we keep reminding our community, the local Wurundjeri people had a value which was no one left behind. And we've got to make sure that that value remains here in our community today. And we've got to make sure that we always maintain that strong sense of compassion, because if we lose that, we're stuffed as a community, as a society.
And I totally agree, Brendan, but also I can understand the consumer also feeling intimidated and scared.
Yep. Yeah.
So we've got this really juxtaposition of issues that I can see both sides. But what are we going to do about it? Because, yes, it is confrontational. Let's get them into some housing and away in that way, try and get that win-win. But that requires leadership, true leadership.
And without the housing piece, everything else becomes so much harder. And all of those costs, all those interfaces with the mental health system, the health system, the justice system, education and training, every other element of it becomes so much harder when you don't have the housing in place. That's the housing first principle. And I think that's really, really important. Just before we crack on, for those joining us online, please make sure you put your questions in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. We're joined this evening by Major Brendan Nottle, Councillor Sarah McKenzie, the Deputy Mayor of the City of Yarra, and Rob Pradolin, the founder of Housing All Australia. So we're having a terrific conversation about housing policy in Melbourne, Victoria, and Australia. Rob Pradolin, there are large amounts of money now coming into this sector. How or in what way will the government best activate that money to make sure that we're delivering the number of houses we need?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because even the 1.2 million target, which people are talking about, which is a lot of what's going to be private sector driven anyhow, is being seen and been used by oppositions, and this is a non-political comment, to say you haven't reached your 1.2 million. The reality is we should have ambitious targets, because if you don't have ambitious targets, you're going to get a target that could easily be met. We have to look at it together. I think this should be considered to be we should be on war footing Because of the normalisation, this is going to get so bad so quickly, Brendan, we haven't seen the peak of homelessness yet. And that's going to cause a whole range of divisions. And why I'm being dramatic and saying we should be at war is during times of war, enemies come together. This is how serious I think, as a business person, as what I'm terming a compassionate capitalist, profit and purpose can unite. And unless we do that, we're never going to get the business community aligning with what we're trying to do as a country. We believe housing is essential infrastructure for a future prosperous country. And we've done a cost-benefit ratio. In Victoria, it's 3-1, better than any infrastructure project we're doing. And we think it should be classified, just like roads, schools and hospitals, as essential and fundamental infrastructure for a country.
So treating it as infrastructure rather than an investment class obviously requires significant reform, particularly at the federal level and particularly around taxation. Sarah, if I can put you on the spot here, I'm a former member of the Labor Party. You're a current member of the Labor Party. In 2019, Labor took a pretty ambitious agenda around negative gearing to the Australian people and had it spat back quite firmly in their faces. Is there going to be an appetite, do you think, from the new federal government to tackle some of these systemic financial issues around housing being treated as an investment product rather than a social good?
I mean, I'm not a member of the federal government, but I would hope so. And it's something that Per Capita will be doing a lot of work on this year. So earlier this year, Per Capita had a community tax summit. We were talking about the different sorts of reforms that we need in this space. Now we have a federal government that has a massive majority, is in a position to be able to make bold changes that can really get their roots in the ground and can't be ripped out. And that's something that you would know is incredibly important in policy making. You know, it's not just whether it's a good policy or not, it's whether it's something that you can make part of the furniture so that when the next lot come in, they can't pull it back out again. So I would like to see, and I hope to see, tax reform being high up on this on the agenda. But it won't just be one thing, taking out negative gearing or taking out capital gains tax. It will be needs to be a whole sort of system reform. And the truth is we haven't had a tax reform for a really long time. We've had things that we call tax reforms, but they are really just tinkering around the edges and that sugar hit sort of stuff. And that will play part into this housing. But yes, reframing housing as infrastructure, as a public good, I think is a really big part of that, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. I just want to jump on the we're at war thing. Something that Victoria, at least, and I think Australia, but Victoria recently has proved that they can do incredibly well is to take an emergency and attack it head on. Obviously, there'll be different opinions on this, but the way that the Victorian state government dealt with the COVID pandemic here, it saved lives. Human beings are alive today because of that approach, and they hit it hard and they went, this is an emergency, we need to deal with it like it's an emergency. And federal government did it as well, acting really fast. We should be looking at housing and other things as well, but certainly housing as an emergency, and we should be applying that same sort of emergency thinking to it. Perhaps that means pulling back on some other things to focus solely on this huge problem, because nothing else can happen until people have a roof over their head.
So it seems extraordinary to me, Brendan Nottle. When I came into the Parliament, I spoke about homelessness as an issue in my inaugural speech, and the amount of rough sleeping was very challenging to me at that time in 2018. During the course of the pandemic, it was almost eliminated. And I, like everyone else, I think I'm suffering from whiplash because we're back to the sort of, it would seem anecdotally, to the kind of 2018 levels, if not worse. Now, how is it that government can turn on and then turn off the solution to rough sleeping? And what would you like to see from a sort of resources focus at your level in dealing with rough sleeping in the CBD?
I think Sarah's point's an interesting one. I think the National Cabinet was a really interesting response. And we've often argued that the issue of homelessness is one of those issues that needs to be lifted above politics, which is the point you're making, and a multi-partisan approach is developed where agreement is made about a basic response to homelessness, a basic response to housing, and then as governments change political colours, they'll be tinkering around the edges, but there is a basic plan that's agreed to by all parties. I think that's what needs to happen. That goes to your point and yours too.
Absolutely.
So,
But the thing is, homelessness is perceived to be the 10% that are seeing on the streets that make people feel intimidated.
Yeah.
There's a whole range of homelessness above that we don't see.
Yeah.
You know, we sponsored a documentary called Undercover. Margot Robbie narrated it. It's now on Netflix. And it's all about Australian women sleeping in cars. Now, as a man, I can't believe we've allowed that to happen, but it's happening all the way across the country. We have to see homelessness as not only just the guy or the lady that's beneath in the street clocks.
Yep.
It's the ones we don't see.
Well, I think to your point too, before COVID hit, there were about 242 people sleeping rough on the streets in the city of Melbourne. So they're the ones that could be seen and counted. So obviously the number was higher than that because there were people that were couch surfing, there were people in squats. But then that number went down to 60 during COVID. It crept up to about 131 and it's on the rise still, except what we're seeing now is your point, Rob, is it's spreading. So we're seeing rough sleeping happening on the streets in locations we haven't seen it before, but we're also seeing an increase in the number of vans that are popping up in areas where there's no parking limits. There's vans popping up in football, what's the word?
Grounds.
Oval
Yeah,
grounds.
yeah.
Popping up in shopping centres as well.
Yeah.
So we're trying to think through how do we connect with those people and try and then link them into supports just to make sure that they're safe and they're being looked after. But the number of people that I think are homeless now is really significant, but we don't have a handle on that number at the moment because we just can't find the people.
And all of that underscores just how important it is to have housing in place so that you can actually reach people with any service.
That's the key.
Because if they're hiding in a van or if they aren't, sleeping literally on the doorsteps of the salvos, it's like, well, how do we even get to them? How do we provide even the first leg up to be able to get out of the mire?
I think there were two key lessons out of COVID. So one was people went into hotels. It wasn't always great. So there was a lack of supervision in the hotel. So some of the behaviours was really challenging. But the other thing that happened was people were put into long-term housing. But again, I think some agencies, including ours, got a roof over somebody's head, ticked the box and said, job done and moved on. But no work was actually done around addressing the drivers for that person's homelessness in the first place. So we saw a lot of people go into long-term housing, but then they just cycled back onto the streets because the triggers for their homelessness weren't addressed. So we're talking about complex mental health issues, we're talking about addictions, we're talking about trauma. None of that was addressed, and so they're back on the streets again, and then a lot more cynical about any opportunities that were presented to them to get off the streets again.
Sarah, we often hear about wraparound services in the per capita's work. Are there actually any examples of jurisdictions in Australia that are getting that piece of it right in your assessment?
Oh, I mean, I think we could do a lot better around it. It's all, you might get a little bit of something. I think we need, firstly, we need more social housing, but community housing stock to be able to house different groups of people. Something that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to particularly homelessness or very low-income people is this idea that they have to be perfect and grateful at every step of the way, right? And so we will get, if we're looking at something, say like a rooming house permit or something, we'll get submissions that are really about the sorts of people's character that could be in that house. This idea of you must be this perfect needy person, and if not, well then you deserve, back to where you are. And it's those wraparound services that really help and support with that. And that's your health services and those very targeted things, but also services around you, right? It makes sense for us to have low-income housing in places like City of Yarra because it has all the trains and all the trams and all the buses and the hospitals and the schools. That makes complete sense. We should be putting it in those areas. I walk down Smith Street, all I can think is we could do with a little less sky and a little more poor people. I'm sure I could find a nicer way to say that, but that's exactly where it should be. But also if we have more social housing, community housing stock where we can have housing supports for different groups, then, we've got women escaping domestic violence, but also I would argue that, and I know it would be unpopular, but that we should have dedicated housing for perpetrators of domestic violence that also have those sort of wraparound supports. Why is it always women and children that have to leave the household, A? But B, don't we want don't we want people to be supported to change as well? And that can all happen in those housing spaces. We could do better.
So it takes enormous maturity, doesn't it, to be able to, look a constituency in the eye, whether it's your ward voters, whether it's my constituents, and say, we're going to have to take some tough decisions here, like resourcing men who've behaved appallingly, but in order to get them on a journey to being better human beings and being better contributors.
Tough, right? And I think part of our political cycle makes it that tough, especially, we've got this majority for one party in federal parliament at the moment, but this idea that you're going to move every 3 years, you're constantly sort of trying to keep everyone happy, it shouldn't be tough. It should not be hard to look at somebody in the eye and say, we're going to spend money on this person who you think is an undesirable because we want less undesirables. You know, like it's not.
So Rob, to you then, busting beyond the political cycle. Obviously, Sarah and I are in politics. Brendan spends a lot of time with politicians, unfortunately, but
I love it.
There is a need to think about this problem way beyond the political cycle, particularly the federal political cycle, which I think the average length of federal government post World War II was 26 months or 28 months. It's just hopelessly short amount of time. How can we set up the system to be insulated from the prevailing political winds of the day? I mean, the coalition has busted up and gotten back together and will bust up again in the next week. They're the sort of pressures that unfortunately are brought to bear on longer-term programs when you have political instability. Is there a way of actually busting out of that?
Well, we hope so, because that's why we formed Housing All Australians as the voice of business, because whilst we may not represent all businesses, I got a pretty good feeling that most people actually care. And business people are actually caring, compassionate capitalists, I'm calling. So what we're trying to do is galvanise business behind the idea of looking at a long-term strategy beyond our own personal life. Because this is going to take 30 to 40 years to solve. You can't turn a tap on and produce housing. COVID, most of the homelessness disappeared. Why? Because they went into somewhere. It's not rocket science. But we have to look at the economics, because ideally, yes, we need to look after everyone, Sarah, but that's not how society works. We have to make compromises that we can live with, but not necessarily have polarised ideals. But I think if business galvanises together and says this is something that we have to do as a country, then both sides of politics should listen. Because part of this is we're trying to create respectful unrest by educating people about what we don't know. Because without respectful unrest, there is never any political self-interest. And that's how society's governed. So as much as we all like to have a magic wand, we have to navigate the politics and make it important for both sides to get together and say, we are at war with housing and its connection to homelessness. What do we want for our grandchildren? Because if we don't, we will definitely have civil unrest. And is that the society we want to leave? No. But it takes time to talk to people. Podcasts like this are important. And it's a matter of getting that viral effect where people sit down and say, shit, this is sort of happening now. I can see the consequences. I want to live my life, but I'm concerned about my grandkids. How do we move the dial?
And it would seem that we almost need to think about it in the way that many have been thinking about climate change as being this genuine intergenerational problem and treating it as an emergency. We're now, having had that rhetoric around that issue for so long, we're now seeing, some good incremental wins, some stuff that's lagging, but housing perhaps is one of the next great economic/social/environmental big challenges that perhaps ought to be tackled in a similar
hierarchy: food and shelter.
Yeah.
If we were populating Australia or a country today, what's the first thing? In fact, the example I normally use, if you're creating a new mine in Western Australia, what's the first thing you do? Housing. Otherwise, you won't get your workers. And it's such a fundamental thing that if we get those two things right, there's a greater chance for the individual and families to be productive citizens and pay tax.
Yeah, well, we can, right? So they do touch each other. Glad you brought up climate, because the renewable transition, right, is going to necessarily mean new workplaces in areas of Australia that perhaps there haven't been such large workplaces. We're talking wind farms and solar farms, and making sure that there is housing there and workers' housing for them, I think will really change the makeup of our city. I want to, if I can, go back to I'm glad, yes, I think housing should be treated as an emergency. But something that Kevin Bell talks about quite a bit, and he obviously sees the issue of housing as a human right and wants us to approach it in that human rights framework. And he says, it's not a housing crisis. We keep on saying housing crisis, but a crisis is something, and I'm paraphrasing, but a crisis is something that happens from time to time in otherwise well-working systems. This is a disaster. This system hasn't been working for decades and decades, and people have known it hasn't been working for decades and decades. And the reason why we're having this larger conversation now is that it's no longer just low-income people who are being hit the hardest. It is hitting everybody, but it's hitting people's children. It's meaning that grandparents are having to drive all across the city to see their grandchildren, because no longer can people live, even rent in the places they grew up in. It's breaking apart communities.
Indeed.
It's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster.
Well, I'll move now to grab one of our questions from online, and Adam has asked how we go about educating people to be more compassionate to homeless people. Before I ask you for a response to that, Brenda Nottle, we'll remind everyone to please pop your questions into the comments below this broadcast. Brenda Nottle, you see both the hyper-tolerant and the intolerant. You see people being extraordinarily generous and people being incredibly mean-spirited when it comes to dealing with rough sleepers, I guess, particularly in the centre of Melbourne. What are the lessons you would share about that issue?
I think generally I would define myself as a pretty hopeful person, but I think when it comes to this question, I'm starting to feel now there's certain individuals and perhaps even groups that can't be shifted in terms of demonstrating compassion towards homeless people. I think their level of self-interest is so deep that that's why I used that word before, which I feel uncomfortable using, but that word apartheid is something that I'm starting to see emerge, which is a real concern for me. I think, sorry to be a downer on this, I'm just speaking from what I'm experiencing at the moment. I think moving from that, I think that the intersection between people that are housed and people that aren't housed is a really powerful and profound intersection. So if we can create those moments, which we do, we run a cafe in the city, it's free. We see about 600 people a day come through that cafe, and we get corporate groups come in and they wait to the tables. They're doing all the practical work, which is really helpful, but that intersection where they actually get to sit down and meet a person that's homeless and have conversation, actually start to realise that person that's homeless is a human being. They're just like everybody else, and that they're often in that circumstance, often through no fault of their own. So when we create that intersection, I think that helps generate a sense of compassion, not with all people, as I mentioned, but certainly with some. So creating those moments where the two groups can actually connect is something that's really useful and important. I think storytelling is really important too. So actually getting people that are rough sleeping or people that have been rough sleeping to tell their story and finding various forums to do that is really important. So rather than getting people speaking on their behalf, getting them to speak for themselves is really powerful too. And not just speaking about their story, but actually sharing their thoughts about what needs to happen, because I think that's profound. Just really quickly to Sarah's point before, when she talks about the disaster that we're experiencing, I've often wondered if what we're trying to do is fix a problem with solutions that have clearly failed for decades. So do we actually need to get to a point where we throw the whole thing up and maybe the solution looks extremely different to anything that we've ever experienced before? I wonder if we've got the courage to actually go down that path and actually reconsider what housing should look like if we're serious about housing all Australians.
Indeed. These are big issues. They're thorny issues. You're with me, Will Fowles, the member for Ringwood in the State Parliament. This is our housing panel, and I'm joined by Major Brenda Nottle, Councillor Sarah McKenzie, and I've just taken to calling you Citizen Rob Pradolin because I feel like everyone else got a title, Rob, and I wouldn't want you to miss out.
Executive Director, Housing All Australians is fine.
That'll do. So we're having a fascinating discussion tonight. In a moment, I'll be asking each of you if there was just one thing you could change about the housing frame in Australia, what it would be. But yes, please, ladies and gents online and right around the globe, do give us your questions in the comments below. Perhaps I'll start with you, Rob. If there was one thing you could change in Australia right now, if you got the blank sheet of paper, what would you do to make a material difference to this housing crisis, or perhaps the Kevin Bell language is this sort of decades-long problem that we just simply haven't addressed?
It's a very difficult question to answer, but I think the one that might bring people's attention together is declare a disaster. Because until you declare a disaster, enemies never get together to try and solve it. And it is really that bad. I've been, when I was in the private sector, and I'm a property developer, everybody, so, this is a bit strange for a property developer talking about homelessness, but it's all linked to our society. And when I was selling apartments, housing and land to people that could afford it, like most Australians, I assumed our governments were looking after our vulnerable people. And I found out that they weren't. There is a lack of understanding and education about where we're heading. We're all too busy doing our lives. So I think people, once they're educated, their views change, because ultimately we live in a democracy. And I want this to be at the ballot box, but with a degree of understanding of the implications, but we're not there. We're not there because we try and ram things into 2 or 3 months of election campaigns, expect people to understand it, but they don't because they're busy. So to me, declare a disaster for the future unless we collectively get together, including business, and set a strategy with a bold target that shouldn't be used as a criticism on the other side of politics to say you haven't reached it, because we're collectively trying to reach it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Sarah McKenzie, your electorate and the city of Yarra probably has one of the most politically engaged populations in Melbourne and perhaps Australia. I've spent a bit of time on the mean streets of Yarra as well, and certainly people have a high level of awareness of the social conditions of those living around them. If you had that opportunity, that clean sheet of paper, what would you be doing to affect real change?
I mean, I think the one thing would be to drastically increase the amount of social housing, and by that I mean setting clear targets. And sure, we might not meet them, but they should be targets that are at least at or higher than social housing need and what we expect it to be over the next 10 years. But just picking up on what we were talking about with homelessness and sort of connected here, I hope that you still feel this way, but since I have been working in politics and I talk to a lot of people, and it has just become incredibly clear to me that most everybody is good most of the time, wants the best for each other. Like I do not buy into, obviously you get some noises. People are wonderful. They want to look after each other. They want to take care of each other. And that is a very Yarra thing. I mean, we always have, and you would know anytime any government comes to something in Yarra and we don't want it, we stick together, and most of the time we win. And that is because they are not just politically engaged, but these are people who are caring and compassionate. Now, one thing that I'm seeing happening in Yarra, but it's probably happening in lots of cities, is that our communities are breaking up. They're breaking up for a whole lot of reasons. One of them is that being together is becoming more expensive. And so what we're focusing on in City of Yarra is, if we're going to build up, which we absolutely can and we should, I'm not saying towers and towers, we can do it pretty well with 4 or 6 stories, but if we're going to build up, we need to bring people down to the ground floor, and it needs to be in places where they can, that is accessible and affordable. So, investing in our sports grounds, finding other ways for people to get around, our business districts, all of that stuff is really important. So I'm really happy for the government to deal with the big problems with planning and that. But they also do need to come to the table with supporting what happens on the ground level, because if we don't build that community, then we start to lose our compassion. We're going to lose that incredible thing that has made our city what it is and made so many of those people the ones that are at the front of protests and fighting, because we'll just stop seeing each other as, part of our
fellow
community.
human beings.
Yeah. So it's
and you risk being on the slippery slope to becoming Los Angeles.
Well, and it's boring, right? Like where I'm in Clifton Hill, sometimes I have to walk. Sometimes if I'm really tired, I have to walk the long way around so that I don't bump into anybody, right? Because we all have houses, and it's about how these houses are designed. We have these houses with these front gardens, and everyone's in their front garden like waving at each other, the stop and chats that are hours long. I love it, but sometimes, my gosh. But we can do that in different housing ways, but we need to think about it. Okay, what is it that brings people together? Because I feel like if something happened at my house or whatever, my whole street would rock up. We had a cat die on our street. The whole street came out for the cat funeral, like it is. And that is built because we see each other, we know each other, and we can find ways to be together. So I think that ties into everything. I know it's not specifically housing, but what do we do around housing? And how do we deal with what NIMBYism? I don't think people pushing back on developments is always NIMBYism. They're dealing with a really big issue in places like City of Yarra where we have such little space. So if we're not investing in, and it's a lot of the infrastructure we need to help share that space better, then it's totally reasonable to say I don't want 100 more people to move in here because I won't be able to park anywhere in the city. And it is just a reality that I need my car to go to work. So how do we deal with that? And it's the things that go around housing. I would want to. So
before I ask you your just one thing, Brendan, can I ask you to respond to that?
Yeah, my 12 things.
No, but that issue around community and just the way the dynamic in the city has changed in the time that you've been there, which is a long time, but particularly in the post-pandemic environment where you've seen a change in the housing mix over the last 5 years, but you've seen a big change in the usage of the city by commercial, corporate, other businesses. How has that affected the sense of community as you see it?
Yeah, I think coming out of COVID, I think the city was on its knees. I still don't think we're fully recovered either. And I think people have reacted as a result of that. So I think small businesses are struggling, just generally speaking. And I think people are looking for a cause for their business to be struggling, and often their anger is directed at people that are rough sleeping on their doorstep or rough sleeping near their property. Is that the reason why their business is on the knees? Not necessarily, but it's the homeless person that's the easy target.
But isn't the reality though, Brendan, that it makes people feel uncomfortable when they walk past, so the perception is that people aren't coming in. It's a really
you should be
very
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You should feel uncomfortable when you walk past.
But you're right. But I think it's pretty unfair to blame.
I'm not saying it's not fair or not, but I mean, that's the reality of what happens with people. That's the thing,
Yeah. But it's tough. I think the world's changed. So I think, the past to place, he's complaining because people aren't coming in like they used to before the COVID. But I think we need to stop and think, do people still carb load at lunchtime like they used to?
Yeah.
Maybe the business model's changed.
Well, that's true. That's true.
It's things like that. Whereas people running some pasta places are actually directing their anger at the person that's homeless.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty unfair. I get that we're uncomfortable, and you're right. We need to be uncomfortable with it rather than just being blasé about it.
But uncomfortable is one thing. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Because, Sarah, the councils have all these planning powers, and yes, things take time. But if we acknowledge it's a disaster, you can't delay decisions much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say we should cut red tape, but there are some things that we could speed up. It's just, and I think the Victorian government is doing that in a lot of ways. We need something back for it though, like we need some more recognition that we need to do what I was talking about, the on the ground stuff. But we could speed things up, absolutely.
But just getting back to the solution bit, let's say, going back to that Morrison government report that was said at 44,500, if you start to project over the next 30 years how many each municipality needs to have, and you must have a time frame on that for approval to get them delivered, it starts to change the whole thing. Because again, like we normalise homelessness, we normalise that if we don't approve this, it's not us, it's someone else going to do it. So it actually is a trickle effect, really.
I think the other thing we need to think about too is we talk about 45,000 houses a year that are needed. I think we need to reflect on where they need to be built, because I reckon there's parcels of land that are sitting there, they're ready for the taking, but no one's ever used them for housing before. So I think we need to reflect on what land we're using. I think we also need to reflect on what a house looks like, what it needs to be. So, I have conversation with people that are rough sleeping, and I say to them, what do you want? What do you want your life to look like? And they say, I just want a normal life. So I say, okay, unpack that. And in the middle of that is a house. They want somewhere to live. And I said, what does that look like? And they say, I'd be happy with a tiny house. I'd be happy with one bedroom, a little place. Does it need to be in the city? No, it needs to be near services, but not necessarily in the city or even in the city. And so I think we need to rethink the 45,000 houses and what they might look like, because I think a lot of us just make an assumption that it has to be on the the old.
Yeah, so,
I agree.
to your exact point, I was having a conversation with a person from that growing cohort, that later middle-aged women.
Yeah.
She'd experienced homelessness. She had been placed in a fantastic service in my electorate, but she said, "Do you know what? All I really want is a caravan. Like if I just had a caravan, I could wake up next to the beach every morning. I'd love it. They're 60 grand, apartments are 400 grand. If someone can just get me a caravan, I would be so happy. I could live on the pension that I've got. It would just suit me down to the ground. Me, the dog, the caravan, the beach, happy as Larry."
Can I just sort of add to that? Because in the documentary, there's a lady that starts off in a caravan, all with the same aspirations.
Yeah.
And at the end, she just gets tired of living in a caravan by herself.
Sure.
So let's put it in reality as well too.
But the
Sure,
different types
I
of
appreciate
housing
that.
makes a really
Yeah, absolutely.
is a really
I
good
agree.
point.
I totally agree.
And I've been thinking a bit about another huge emerging issue in Australia, which is an aging population, people who are unable to age in place because perhaps they haven't got family around. We've got some areas where we can absolutely have more housing in that block. Could solve a whole lot of problems. What's that period, between needing really daily support and just needing somebody around for company or to check that you haven't fallen over. And we could solve that, especially in some of the inner city areas that have, the stables out the back.
Can I just touch on that because that's an important issue. There's 13 million empty bedrooms in this country. 1% 138,000. Usually with people that are older that have got spare bedrooms that don't want to move, right? They can't rent that room because if you rent to get $1, you lose your pension and your capital gains tax.
They can't rent it, yeah.
Therefore, they do nothing. They could be for key workers, nurses,
but they
et
also
cetera.
need to be able to take care of the houses, and that's another houses falling apart. There's lots of people, and they're wealthy, but they bought their houses for $20,000 when they bought them. Just because they're $4 million now, it doesn't mean that they're rolling in cash.
We have to relook at it. That's what I'm saying. We have to relook at all these opportunities. There's a lot of existing infrastructure. How do you actually utilise that?
I think the other thing too is the talk's got to stop. I
agree.
We've got to continue the conversations, absolutely. But I think, man, these conversations have been going on for an awful long time. So we need some action.
We need to get shit done.
Absolutely. Now. Yeah.
No time to waste.
Yeah. But I think we also need to rethink the whole sort of
Straight to the promo reel, that one.
Yes, exactly.
the whole housing landscape, because I reckon there's a vision there that we haven't landed on yet. But so we've got to keep working on that.
Different ways to live together.
Absolutely.
I'd be very
correct.
happy living, and some of my friends who are buying in, living with friends and having families together. And I think that's absolutely the future of housing. I'm very happy to do that. And having that long-term security, but not necessarily in a nuclear family. So, different sorts of ways of living as well.
Yep.
I'd be very happy to live in one of those beautiful houses in Spencer Street, Clifton Hill, in a room, so long as the person didn't lose anything out of it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be wrapping up shortly, and I want to thank everyone who's contributed online as part of this terrific conversation I've been having with Rob Pradolin, Sarah McKenzie, and Brendan Nottle. We're going to finish with the question, what's one moment in your work recently that made you feel hopeful? And perhaps, Rob, I might start with you.
Oh, Jesus. Look, I got to say, we started this journey several years ago about seeing how many private sector people actually are out there that care about this issue. And we are overwhelmed with the interest by the private sector to want to help. Just no one actually speaks their language. And yes, the community housing sector is fantastic. They do a great job, but we can't rely on a small niche market to solve a huge problem. So I'm actually hopeful that, and the conversation with businesses end generally with the same outcome. They all say, how can we help? We have to galvanise everybody by educate and bring them on the journey and show them what it's going to look like if we don't. And it's not us. It's our grandkids and their descendants. That should be the picture.
Absolutely. And how about you, Brendan? You have extraordinary interactions, I suspect, every day of your working life. What is a moment that's made you feel hopeful recently?
I think two. I'll be quick.
Sure. No.
One was a person who'd been living on the streets. Life was completely out of control. So his whole life was just incredibly chaotic. And he got offered a one-bedroom place, and it's transformed him, completely transformed him. And I think the other thing too is we've got a little conversation going on at the moment about Can we access some relocatables, access some land, which we don't want to own the land. We just want to borrow the land for a period of time, get those relocatables on there. We've had that conversation with some people that are sleeping rough, and they're saying as soon as that's on, we're in. Because they see that just having a roof over their head with some support will be transformative for them. So it doesn't require a lot. We just got to get rid of the red tape, and then I think people start to land on their feet, which would be really powerful for them.
Sarah McKenzie?
I'm disgustingly hopeful. I'm very optimistic, and I think that is, the right way to go. If the outcome's not going to be good at the end, it may as well be enjoyable getting there. But last week in the council space, I mean, obviously I'm in research work regularly, but in the council space it was National Neighbourhood House Week, and they are the places that make me feel hopeful. We've got 9 in City of Yarra. These are places that where community really comes together, where people are treated equally no matter where they come from, and where there are still people not just have been there for 20 years, but people in my age group who are working in these spaces and volunteering in these spaces just because they want to make their community the best it can possibly be. And sure, in politics, I picked my little thing. This is how I think I can make change. But you look all around outside here and you will find people that are finding their little bit to make change. I think people are wonderful and we can solve this solution, but we do need to move faster than we're going at the moment. But yeah, I'm hopeful, just generally.
Well, I'm very pleased about that. My little hopeful experience was outside Ringwood Station the other morning. We were doing some campaigning around our issue of getting housing introduced as a human right in the Victorian Charter. Now, this comes on the back of a lengthy federal election campaign. You would expect people would be necessarily a bit, people in T-shirts trying to give me stuff. Gee willikers, I've had plenty of that. The level of engagement, the level of interest, the conversations was absolutely fantastic. But I'll leave you with this. I was having a conversation out the back of your premises with a rough sleeper the other day, Brendan, when we caught up. And I said to him, if there was just one thing that would make a big difference for you, what would it be? And he just said, mate, if you just get me a house, everything else becomes heaps easier. And to me, that was a great affirmation that we're on the right track. Housing is critical to this problem, the problem of homelessness. Housing is going to be critical to intergenerational fairness and equity. Housing is going to be critical to keeping our cities together and our people together. I've been delighted tonight to be sharing this housing panel with Brendan Nottle, Sarah McKenzie and Rob Pradolin. Thank you all for being here and being part of it. We look forward to continuing on with the conversation. Please make sure you sign our petition in support of housing being a human right here in the state of Victoria. We'll pop that link in the comments below. In the meantime, I've been Will Fowles. You've been fantastic, and we'll see you next time round.